Devil May Cry 2. I was super excited when revisiting the first game for the previous video. Not so much when revisiting this sequel, but it is a big part of the franchise's history and it does deserve to get covered. So the background of this game is quite interesting. See, in the 1990s, Capcom was this powerhouse in the arcade scene, pumping out classics like Street Fighter and Marvel vs. Capcom, but around the early 2000s, when arcades were getting less and less popular and the home console market was skyrocketing, especially with the launch of the PlayStation 2, Capcom knew it needed to reorganise its main development team. Now, the team that handled the first Devil May Cry, led by Hideki Kamiya, were busy working on a new IP, a little gem called Beautiful Joe. So the sequel had to go somewhere else, and Capcom decided that this would be one of the first console projects that their main production studio could work on, a team experienced in developing arcade fighting games. Now, the co-creator of Rival Schools, another Capcom classic, Hideaki Itsuno, was brought to the team late in development to take over creative control. But with the early deadlines, the drafting of various studio members, and a lack of passion in this project because it wasn't their own IP, Devil May Cry 2 unfortunately suffered. And it's a shame because there's a cool game here struggling to present itself. So Devil May Cry 2, after a few delays, finally released in early 2003 exclusively for the PlayStation 2. It received a HD remaster later in the 2010s for the PS3, PS4, Xbox 360, Xbox One, Nintendo Switch and Windows PC. For this video I played the version in the HD collection through backwards compatibility on PlayStation 5. Devil May Cry 2 once again has you take control of the demon hunter Dante, only now with his cheeky attitude and his talkative personality zapped away, replaced with a more serious tone. It does come off quite strong and it feels almost as if it's like something really bad has happened to Dante between the events of the first game and this one, but we never get much mention of this. The most likely explanation is that they just didn't have time to really flesh out his new character change to make it seem more natural for Dante to behave almost entirely different between the two entries. Dante's redesign also expressed this personality change, having a more sharper facial structure and frowned expression. His costume went with a deeper black used on the body piece of his suit, which actually does look really good. Thankfully, Dante still controls pretty much the same as the original. You'll still be blasting through the menaces of hell, mixing together your sword attacks with gunfire, and you can still enter your devil trigger form, giving you increased stats and more powerful attacks for a short period of time. He returns with all of his athletic animations, now featuring a new dodge roll that allows him to clear the way of enemy attacks and even run up and along walls. There is, however, a much smaller pool of attacks now due to you no longer able to unlock new moves with your red orbs when you collect defeated enemies and get high grades at the end of the levels. Instead, the upgrades that are here are only stat relative now and don't extend your move list. It caused me to only really pour red orbs into the beginning sword that you start with and the pistols, because damage was all that really mattered anymore. In the original, you had quite a varied amount of melee weapons that you'd find throughout your adventure in the castle, from gauntlets to a lightning sword and the shape-shifting Spada blade. But in DMC2, your arsenal is watered down to just having 3 swords that all play the same, just one is short and does more damage, one is long and does less damage, and the one you start off with is the balanced one. This just really drains much of the fun out of the combat when you're only really going to be choosing the better suited sword for your own convenience rather than having to choose which is best for the situation. Now, there's a little bit more variety in the ranged combat because alongside your staple dual pistols, you also unlock the double-barreled shotgun from the first game, a rocket launcher, and even twin submachine guns. And this sequel now lets you switch your ranged weapon with a press of the button instead of having to go into the pause menu every single time, which is one of the better inclusions of this game. But DMC2 relies very heavily on this gun combat, that it quickly becomes quite repetitive and the most convenient solution to winning almost every single battle. The arenas that you're fighting within are now much wider and emptier than the first game, leaving you with a lot of room to fire off your guns between you and the enemy. and the bosses have been whittled down to being simple bullet sponges in most cases. Devil May Cry 2 has some of the worst battles in the history of video games, or at least the ones that I've played, and that truly is not an exaggeration. Enemies like the infested helicopter and the infested tank really show how drab the development of this game must have been. You just stand and slash away, or strafe left to right every now and again whilst tapping the shoot button as fast as you can. Those are really the strategies for a lot of the battles in this game, and it's a shame because there's actually some very interesting and neat enemy designs here, from a monster that can morph out of a skyscraper, which looks really epic. One of the more standard enemies is this like creative skeleton design, which is trapped inside of a cage. And there's some very cool inspiration took from pagan and biblical depictions of demons with the goat heads and the hooves, but battling them just isn't really nearly as fun. The most memorable battle for me was probably Bolverk. He's a skeleton king with a huge blade that gives him really long reach, plus he has two guardian wolves that are also pouncing around trying to grab you. And you battle him in a smaller enclosed arena, so the boss truly has some challenge and you need to use your rolls and your melee weapon to take him down. It's very reminiscent of the Nello Angelo battles of the previous game, and I think that's why I really liked it. It tests you with the gun combat and the sword combat, which is what a good Devil May Cry boss should do. Now in Devil May Cry 2, which is set after the first game, Dante comes to the island of V de Mali upon request of a new female hero, Lucia, who needs his help in order to save her homeland. An evil businessman known as Arius runs the Ouroboros Corporation, which has taken over the capital city on the island and is channeling hellish powers in a bid to summon the powerful demon Argasax, who has promised Arius unlimited power. The old Dante would have been thrilled to help Lucia, but this new Dante has to kind of grunt and decide whether to help or not, dependent on a coin toss. There's a lot more variety of locations with this sequel, as you're travelling all across this huge country that starts off with a small European-like village, then you move into the more modern city full of skyscrapers. Arius is a pretty comical villain, looks almost like if you stuck Waluigi through an AI program to make him look more realistic. Arius is the penultimate boss, and while he's not that difficult, the cutscene following the battle makes it all worth it.
Here's your crown.
What I like about that exchange is we actually get a little bit of the old Dante's humour back. Dante meets back up with Lucia and we find out that she's actually a demon herself, created by Arius to serve her, but he abandoned her when she was defective. This was when she was raised by the guardians of her village. As the portal to hell opens up, with Argasax almost through, they argue who should go, and while Lucia believes that it should be her because of this new revelation, Dante reassures her that devils never cry, meaning that she is more than just what she thinks. Dante flips his coin once again, which happens to land on heads, and sets off to have the final boss against Argasax. So this villain is split into two forms. The first is this like goopy form that has bits of a number of past bosses stuck within it, some even from the first game like Griffin. You can move around it and battle each boss one at a time with them having their usual attacks. What's funny is you can see how much better designed the first game bosses were over the new ones, in which you can just stand far enough away and just rain hell on them with your bullets. But Griffin and Phantom actually make you work a little harder. Upon defeating the Goop form, you then battle Argasax's true form, this fiery fallen angel. This is a truly challenging battle for this game, down to the speed at which Argasax moves and the less time that you have to attack. Saving your devil trigger for the right moments is your best bet to win. Now, completing the game and defeating Argasax, you might think, was that it? But the game rewards you with a message saying, challenge Lucia's disc. Arguably, one of the few great features of Devil May Cry 2 is that it comes with 2 discs, and while the first features your staple Dante experience, the second disc allows you to play the game from Lucia's perspective. Lucia controls much like Dante, just having different animations. Instead of a sword, she's equipped with dual blades, and instead of handguns, she's equipped with throwable daggers. Later, she even gets grenades, with little use they are. The levels are 90% the same as Dante's, with you going through most of the same locations and battling again 90% of the same bosses and enemies. The only major new section that was included into Lucia's shorter campaign was an underwater segment with a shark demon boss fight. And I mentioned how poor the underwater segments were in the previous game, but this segment really makes the previous one feel like some of history's finest art. The controls are just not refined, with you moving so slow and restricted to only using your grenades, which are pretty useless underwater, or a bowgun, which once again makes the gameplay feel like it's playing itself. Because Lucia stayed behind when Argisax was coming through the portal from hell and Dante drove off to battle him, Lucia's campaign ends in her battling her creator Arius, which has now been deformed and twisted by the demonic power possessing him. This is another 2-phase battle, but not quite as challenging as Argisax was, so he'll be taken down pretty quickly if you're playing Lucia's disc second. With Argisax and Arius both defeated, peace to Via Mali is restored, but Dante still hasn't returned from hell. In an after-credits scene, Lucia is seen waiting for Dante in his shop, just as it looked in the first Devil May Cry. She's spinning his false coin, which is in fact printed heads on both sides. She hears a bike engine outside and rushes out the door, leaving us to question if it was Dante returning. But I guess we'll have to wait and see, as that brings us to the end of Devil May Cry 2. Now, in terms of unlockables, completing each character's campaign nets you a new costume based on Diesel clothing. Yeah, Capcom partnered with the Diesel clothing brand in the making of this game. Kind of an odd bit of product placement history, but Dante and Lucia both have real Diesel branded outfits to unlock, which at the time you could have gone out and bought these sets yourself if you liked them enough, although I hear that they were sold out when Devil May Cry 2 released. But how cool is that though, spotting your new fashion trend in a video game? In exchange, Capcom placed Devil May Cry 2 demo kiosks in some Diesel stores, so you could play some Devil May Cry 2 while shopping for a new pair of jeans. Who wouldn't want to do that? Completing the game in hard mode will then unlock you a third playable character, Trish, from the first game, who is mysteriously absent from this game's story. Surprisingly, she plays very different to Dante and Lucia in that she actually retains DMC1 Dante's moveset, with the Spada sword, the pistols, and the Nightmare laser weapon. Overall, Devil May Cry 2 is a pretty strong piece of video game history, and that's why I just had to cover it. This was a game that had some very neat ideas, but those ideas became unfortunately butchered during the troubled development cycle. There's some cool new enemy designs, but they boil down to feeling like bullet sponges most of the time. There's a new armory of weapons to use, and even implements a quick switch option for your guns. However, the swords are simply just stat changes, with no new moves or animations. It also attempts to add additional replay value by including a second disc with a second campaign from Lucia's perspective. A really great idea for expanding upon this new character, but once again, loading it up, you'll find that 90% of Dante's levels, bosses, and enemies are just recycled, and it really exemplifies how rushed and much of an afterthought this likely was. The narrative is also choppy and abridged at times, and you really need to dig deep to find the more positive undertones that this story is trying to convey, like Dante's relationship with his father Spada and following him in his footsteps, and Lucia's relationship with her adoptive mother and working hard to be more than just a demonic construct. The game just doesn't focus enough on these two relationships. If maybe the development was different, maybe if Hideaki Esuno was brought on board to lead the team earlier, then things could have been different, but based on my experience revisiting this game, I'm going to give it a below average score of a D for dull. It's far from the worst game I've ever played, it doesn't deserve my lowest score of an E, but it sure dropped in quality significantly from the previous game. Luckily, Devil May Cry 2 still sold well over 1 million copies in just the first half of 2003, prompting Capcom to greenlight a third entry in the series. And in a respectful move, Hideaki Itsuno and his team, despite being hit with the heavy criticism, used this to strengthen their motivation to stick with the franchise and work on creating a follow-up game that would fix the faults of this one, which is certainly commendable, as many development teams most likely would have walked away from the franchise. So join us next time on Don Critic, where we will tackle the next step for Devil May Cry, the final entry on the PlayStation 2. Thanks all so much for watching, and I'll see you there. Take care.
Devil May Cry 2.